feet. The date is March 26, 1945. The air over the German landscape is a suffocating mixture of sulfur, pulverized concrete, and the metallic tang of blood. Across the Rhine, the Allied advance is no longer a sprint feet. It has become a grueling, inch-by-inch crawl through the jagged remains of the Third Reich feet. Intelligence reports are flooding into the command centers of the U.S. 120th Infantry Regiment feet, and every single one of them is painted in the color of catastrophe. Entrenched in the dense feet, dark thickets of the Spitz forest is a nightmare made flesh feet. A reinforced battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. These are not the weary conscripts of the Volkssturm. These are the fanatical remnants of Nazi Germany's most ideological warriors feet. Men who have sworn to turn the German soil into a graveyard for every American soldier who sets foot upon it. The statistics are haunting. In the last 48 hours, feet, the forward reconnaissance units have suffered a casualty rate exceeding 45% feet. Every time a patrol pushes into the tree line, they are met by the terrifying feet, high-pitched burp of MG-42's machine guns, the Hitler's buzzsaw, firing at 200 rounds per minute feet. The experts in London and at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force have reached a grim consensus feet. A frontal assault on this pocket will be a slaughterhouse. They estimate that to clear the Spitz woods feet, the Allies will have to endure at least 600 casualties in the opening hour alone. The map is a sea of red feet, and the generals are paralyzed by the mathematics of death feet. What the High Command didn't know was that the solution to this tactical deadlock wasn't sitting in a war room, surrounded by cigars and mahogany. It wasn't a general, a decorated colonel, or even a man of legal voting age feet, standing in a muddy foxhole just 600 yards from the German wire was a boy 5 foot 6 inches tall feet, wearing a steel M11 helmet that wobbled on his head and holding an MM1 Garand with hands that should have been turning the pages of a high school yearbook. His name was Private First Class Frank Bucky Mearls, to the United States Army feet. He was a 19-year-old soldier from Ohio. To his mother back in the States, he was a 14-year-old runaway. Fanned in the next 6 hours feet. This child who shouldn't have been there was about to do something the experts deemed a physical and psychological impossibility feet. He was about to capture an entire SS battalion without firing a single shot. By the spring of 1945, feet, the Allied momentum was stalling against the West Wall and the fanatical defense of the German heartland feet. The German strategy had shifted from coordinated maneuvers to Festung, or fortress defense, a desperate feat. Cornered animal logic where every basement was a pillbox and every barn was a sniper nest. The stakes were at their absolute zenith. If the Allies couldn't break the Spitz pocket feet, the entire flank of the 9th Army would be exposed to a potential counter-strike feat. A move that Hitler's remaining generals hoped would delay the end of the war by months feet. Every day the line didn't move was another day. The gas chambers of the Holocaust continued to run feet. And another day that thousands of young men on both sides were fed into the furnace of a dying regime feet. The failed solutions were piling up in the form of twisted metal and charred remains. M4 Sherman tanks feet, the workhorses of the American advance feet, were being picked off with surgical precision by German Panzerfausts hidden in the dense undergrowth feet. Heavy bombers couldn't see through the thick canopy of the forest to provide close air support. Feet, and the artillery was firing blindly, hitting nothing but trees. The expert consensus was to wait. Feet, to pull back and level the entire forest with a 3-day barrage. Feet. But the bureaucracy of war was blind to the reality on the ground. 3 days would give the SS time to reinforce, dig deeper, and perhaps even slip away to strike elsewhere. Frank Merrill's watched this stalemate with the raw, unpolished impatience of youth. Born in 1930, Frank had spent his childhood in the Appalachian foothills of Ohio. A place where survival meant knowing the land better than the animals you hunted. He had watched his older brothers ship out to the Pacific and North Africa, and the fire of duty. Or perhaps just the restlessness of a boy in a small town had consumed him. He had no credentials, no high school diploma, and certainly no tactical training beyond the frantic blurred weeks of basic training he'd bluffed his way through using a forged birth certificate. His job in the 120th Infantry was simply he was a runner and a scout. In the eyes of the brass, he was disposable. A set of eyes to be sent forward to find exactly where the bullets were coming from before he was replaced by another name on a manifest. The tactical situation around the Rhine was governed by a set of brutal mathematical certainties. The probability of survival for a lead scout in a frontal assault was calculated by Army statisticians as where Kadau represented the density of enemy fire and Tita represented the time exposed in the kill zone. For the boys of the 120th, that pedo was approaching zero. The senior staff, educated at West Point and steeped in traditional doctrine, could only see the war through these numbers. They calculated that it would take a minimum of 3 infantry companies, supported by a full battalion of artillery, to even dent the SS perimeter. They were prepared to trade lives for yards in a ratio that was becoming unsustainable as the American public grew wary of the mounting death tolls. Frank, however, was not thinking about survival probabilities. 1,000 feet. He was thinking about the way the wind moved through the pine needles and the way the German sentries coughed in the damp morning air. He noticed that the German defense relied on a specific logistical rhythm, because their fuel supplies were nearly non-existent, they only moved their armored assets, the few remaining Panzer IVs, during the twilight hours to avoid detection by Allied J-boats or fighter bombers. This meant there was a specific window where the heavy guns were stationary and the infantry was changing shifts. Frank Merrill's didn't look like the heroes on the recruitment posters. He looked like a mascot. He was often teased by the veterans of the 120th. Men who had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen hell of the Bulge. They called him the Kid, and joked that he needed a booster seat to drive a Jeep. But while the veterans were focused on the macro, level horror of the war, Frank was focused on the micro, level observation of the terrain, He possessed a preternatural ability to read the forest, a skill honed by years of tracking deer through the Ohio brush. While the senior officers were debating the strategic density of the German line in heated tents, Frank was sitting in a freezing foxhole, sketching in a grimy notebook. He noticed a pattern that the experts, with all their maps and intelligence intercepts, had missed entirely. Every evening, at exactly 18th Odrid, The German MG-42 nests shifted their positions to avoid the American counter battery fire that usually followed the sunset. For a window of exactly 12 minutes, a narrow, jagged ravine on the eastern edge of the woods was left completely unmonitored. This was his moment of insight. Frank realized that the impenetrable SS Battalion wasn't a solid wall, but a series of interconnected cells that relied heavily on psychological dominance and rigid timing, If someone could slip through that 12-minute gap and reach the command bunker at the center, the entire structure would collapse. To the officers, this was a suicide mission. To Frank, it was just like slipping past a game warden in the middle of the night. He saw not a battalion of monsters, but a group of men who were tired, hungry, and bound by a clock that he now understood better than they did, His lack of credentials was actually his greatest asset, because he hadn't been trained to see the proper way to attack a reinforced position. He was free to see the obvious way to bypass it. He understood that the German psyche in 1945 was brittle. They were waiting for a reason to stop fighting, but they were too terrified of their own officers to be the first ones to drop their weapons. Frank's plan wasn't based on firepower, it was based on the physics of a bluff. He calculated that the perceived strength of an attacking force was more important than its actual numbers on feet, especially when the enemy was already standing on the edge of a nervous breakdown, Frank knew that if he asked for permission to lead a reconnaissance mission, he would be laughed out of the tent or thrown into the brig. So, on the night of March 25, he entered what he called his secret workshop, an abandoned, half-bombed blacksmith shop on the outskirts of the American line. There, he began assembling a kit for a plan that defied every manual in the U.S. Army. He didn't want the standard heavy gear. He wanted speed and psychological impact, He stripped his M1 Garand of its heavy wooden stock, replacing it with a rigged wire frame to make it lighter, and gathered every white phosphorus grenade he could find. The chemical reaction of white phosphorus, 4-Fafio-Abi-2, Riteropita-4010, creates a dense, terrifying cloud of white smoke that also burns at extremely high temperatures. To the Germans, it looked like a precursor to a chemical attack or a massive artillery barrage, Frank intended to use this to create the illusion of a much larger force. He also performed a daring theft, He slipped into the intelligence tent and stole a set of captured German officer uniforms and a heavy, battery-operated megaphone. When his immediate superior, Sergeant Miller, caught him tinkering in the dark, the reaction was swift and harsh. That is illegal, Mirals. You're 14 playing at 19, and now you're playing at being a spy. You can't just walk into an SS camp and expect them to surrender. That's not how war works. It's impossible, and it's crazy. Miller threatened to have him court-martialed for stealing government property and for the absurdity of his contraption. A megaphone strapped to a harness with extra batteries. Frank didn't argue. Instead, under the cover of a moonless sky and the rhythmic thud of distant mortars, he decided to test his theory. He slipped into the dead zone of the ravine. His heart hammered against his ribs. 14-year-old boy walking into the mouth of the wolf. He reached the first German outpost, so close he could smell the bitter tobacco of the sentries. Instead of shooting, he threw a smoke canister and yelled a single, authoritative command in his limited, broken German. Feet. The German sentries, confused by the smoke and the sheer audacity of a voice coming from within their own perimeter, didn't fire. They hesitated. In that hesitation, Frank saw his victory. He realized that the enemy wasn't a machine. Feet. They were exhausted men waiting for someone to tell them it was over. The next morning, Frank Merrills was no longer a hidden scout. He was a prisoner of his own side. Feet. He had been caught returning from the German side of the line, and the military bureaucracy was ready to crush him. Feet. He sat in a makeshift command center. Feet. Facing a tribunal of officers who were ready to charge him with reckless endangerment and desertion of post. The atmosphere was thick with hostility. Feet. The experts argued that the 12th SS would never surrender to anything less than a division strength assault. Seared. Frank said, standing before Colonel William Hicks. Feet. A man whose face was a map of every battle from North Africa to the Rhine. I was in their camp. I saw their faces. They are starving. They are out of ammunition for their heavy guns. Feet. They are holding that line on nothing but bluff and fear. If we send one platoon through the Eastern Ravine at 1800, we can take the whole battalion. The room erupted. Majors and captains shouted over one another. Feet. Calling Frank a leer, a child, and a traitor to common sense. One intelligence officer slammed his fist on the table. Feet. Citing the unbreakable morale of the Hitlerjugend units. The 12th SS does not surrender! They fight to the death! Feet. You're going to get an entire company killed because you think you're in a comic book. The consensus was that the boys should be sent to the stockade and the real soldiers should wait for the 3-day artillery barrage to begin. Feet. But Colonel Hicks didn't join the shouting. He walked over to Frank and looked at the boys' boots. Feet. They were caked in a specific, grayish clay that only existed on the far side of the ravine. He looked at the megaphone and the stolen uniform. Feet. He saw a boy who had bypassed the entire German defense while his experts were still arguing over map coordinates. Feet. He knew that the current strategy was a recipe for a meat grinder. Feet. The boy is right about the clay. Hicks silenced the room with a single raised hand. Feet. And he's right about the stalemate. We are sitting here dying in increments. If he's wrong, I'll lose a scout and a few volunteers. If he's right, feet. We break the Rhine tonight, overruling his entire staff and the rigid bureaucracy of the Ninth Army. Feet. Hicks gave Frank a 6-man team and 4 hours to prepare. He told the boy, if you get killed, feet, I'm the one who goes to jail. Don't make me look like an idiot, Bucky. Feet. If you want to see the actual hand-drawn maps and the after-action reports that the Army tried to bury for decades, click the link in the description and subscribe to our Deep Archive newsletter. Feet. We release one declassified story every week that the History Channel won't touch. Feet. Subscribe now to help us keep these forgotten heroes alive. Angers. At exactly 7:10 on March 26, 1945, feet, the Merrills team moved. The objective was the Spitz Command bunker located at coordinates 50 dials 81A Circ N7, a Circ E. Frank had calculated the audacity factor using a mental model that modern special forces would recognize as the ODA loop. Feet. He knew that by the time the Germans realized what was happening, the psychological trap would already be closed. Feet. Frank led the 6 veterans, men twice his age, through the jagged ravine. He moved with a silent, predatory fluidity that left the older soldiers breathless. Feet. They reached the perimeter of the SS Battalion headquarters at 18:04. Feet. Just as the German machine gunners were shifting their positions. Feet. Frank signaled his men to fan out and begin firing their weapons into the air in rapid, staggered bursts. Feet. Creating the illusion of a much larger force. At the same time, feet. They unleashed a barrage of phosphorus and smoke grenades, turning the headquarters into a blinding, white, hot chaos. Feet. Frank stood on a fallen pine tree, grabbed his megaphone, and channeled every ounce of authority he had. Feet. He didn't sound like a 14-year-old. He sounded like the voice of doom. AHT&G! He roared into the smoke. Waro sorrow widaliwo T1DUTATE air 28 turled einen twi skewer feet. So you are noro andio laliv sto andio barn. It was a bluff of astronomical proportions. Feet. There were only 7 Americans in the woods. There were over 400 SS soldiers in the immediate vicinity. Feet. But the psychological timing was perfect. The Germans, already demoralized by months of retreat and the sudden, violent intrusion into their command center, broke. Feet. They assumed that if an American officer was shouting commands from the center of their camp, the perimeter must have already fallen. Feet. The statistics of that afternoon are among the most incredible in the history of the European theater. Feet. With 0 Allied casualties and exactly 0 shots fired at a human target. Feet. Frank Merrells and his 6 men captured 422 German soldiers. This included 15 high-ranking SS officers. Feet. 12 heavy MG-42 machine guns and 3 intact Panzer IV tanks that had been the bane of the American advance. Feet. The kill ratio was technically infinite since the entire force surrendered without a single American drop of blood being spilled. Feet. The enemy reaction was a mixture of horror and profound humiliation. When the German commander, Untersturm Herr Hans Joachim, was brought before Frank to hand over his Walther P-38. Feet. He stared at the boy in the oversized uniform. Feet. When he realized that his elite battalion had been outmaneuvered and intimidated by a child. Feet. He reportedly collapsed into a chair and put his head in his hands. Later, in a prisoner of war interrogation, Joachim stated, "We were prepared to fight the American army. We were not prepared to be tricked by a ghost." Feet. When I saw the commander was a boy, I knew the 1,000-year reich was a lie. Feet. The lives saved were not just American. Had the 3-day artillery barrage taken place, feet, nearly every one of those 422 Germans would have been vaporized or buried alive. Feet. Frank had achieved the ultimate military objective, victory without destruction. Corporal Sam Jenkins, one of the veterans who followed Frank that day, spoke in a 1994 testimonial. Feet. We went into those woods expecting to die. We had written our last letters. Because of Frank. Feet. Because of that kid who shouldn't have been there, we all came home. He didn't just capture a battalion. Feet. He saved the lives of every man in our company. Stories like this are the reason we do what we do. Feet. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the people who refuse to follow the script. Feet. If you think the world needs to remember names like Frank Merrells, Zows, and Feet, hit that like button and tell us in the comments what you would have done in his shoes. Feet. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a moment of forgotten history. After the miracle at Spitz, Feet, the military bureaucracy finally caught up with Frank Merrells. feet. When the true extent of his age was discovered during the processing of the Distinguished Service Cross paperwork, feet, the Army panicked. They couldn't have the public knowing a 14-year-old was doing the work of a battalion. His medals were quietly shelved, and Frank was, dishonorably, discharged for fraudulent enlistment, feet. Though the discharge was later upgraded to honorable after a quiet intervention by Colonel Hicks, feet. He was sent back to Ohio in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended, feet. With a stern warning never to speak of his service, feet. The production numbers of the final push into Germany are staggering: over 4 million Allied troops and 10,000 tanks, feet. But the tactical legacy of Frank's bluff is still studied today, feet. Modern psychological operations manuals often reference the Merrill's infiltration as a textbook case of how a small, feet, motivated force can achieve total victory by targeting an enemy's expectation rather than their armor, feet. The equation for tactical surprise, often expressed as, where AU is information, AUD is audacity, feet, and TDALD is timing, was never more perfectly balanced than in those woods in March 1945. Frank Merrill's returned to a quiet, unassuming life in the Midwest. He became a master mechanic. He married his high school sweetheart and raised 3 children. He never joined the VFW, feet. And he never wore his old uniform to a parade, feet. He refused dozens of interviews and book offers during the 1990s. Greatest Generation, boom, feet. When his local paper finally tracked him down shortly before his death in 2002, feet. He remained characteristically humble. He didn't want the fame, he just wanted to be a grandfather. "I wasn't a hero," Frank said, his voice still carrying a hint of that Ohio rasp. Feet. "I was a boy who was scared and wanted the shooting to stop." Feet. "I looked at those German soldiers and didn't see enemies. I saw tired men who were looking for an excuse to quit." Feet. "I just gave them that excuse. Anyone would have done the same if they could see what I saw." Feet. Frank Merrill's last words to his family were a reminder of the moral lesson he lived. Feet. "It's not the size of the man in the fight, it's the truth he carries." He remains a ghost in the official histories, feet. A name rarely mentioned in the textbooks alongside Patton or Eisenhower, feet. But for the descendants of the 120th Infantry, he is the reason their families exist today. He proved that sometimes, feet, to end a war of monsters, you don't need a general, you just need a child who refuses to believe in the impossible, feet. The miracle at Spitch wasn't just about a capture, feat. It was about the power of a single individual to rewrite the mathematics of death. Frank Merrill's died as he lived. A quiet man with a secret that saved a battalion and changed the world one bluff at a time.